Right, an early morning here in Cape Town, still cold and dark, but woken up with the good news that they've done away with the mask laws. So it looks like, and most of the lockdown laws have been done away with. So it looks like freedom is back in Cape Town anyway. Probably not in Australia where Dave Freemantle is sitting.
We've got no masks at the moment, and lockdowns, no more lockdowns at all.
Okay. Yeah. Well, where I'm going to in the Philippines, there's still strict masks everywhere. So we'll see. But I want to welcome Dave Freemantle. Dave was a member of the famous Intake 147, and it was a double intake. And so Dave had some experiences in the Rhodesia Regiment. And so following on our interview we did with Lieutenant Dave Steadman, who was an officer also from Intake 147, I thought it'd be nice for Dave Freemantle to give us a little bit more of the background, because Dave Steadman focused on the Battle of Inyanga, whereas Dave Freemantle is going to tell us a little bit more about what happened in Intake 147 and how they were split up into different companies. And so without further ado, Dave, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, John. Right. It's a complicated sort of story, because I first did this book, and this was actually an exercise in post-traumatic stress, basically, because it was actually titled A Hole in Our Lives Forever, which is taken from a poem from Sergeant Otto Crick, his daughter, when they went back to them and then lost their farm and everything there. And she wrote this poem, and she said, because of him, I'll forever have a hole in my heart forever. And so we took that sort of title because losing your whole country and everything, having fought for it, it's like an empty hole. And to try and fill that hole, so I wrote this book specifically at that time to try and reconnect with everybody and get their stories in, and to record it as a history, because what we went through was quite unique, really. And I don't really want to focus on the fact that we were any different, but when you look at the circumstances and everything, and also like the culmination of the book Never Fear 147, it was a strange sort of setup, because we the amount of people that were in it was a very large intake. What we thought was a very large intake, but at the time, Intake 146 was there as well. So we'd only like 8 weeks behind them in our training. But during the Osby course down in Guello at the School of Infantry, what happened was at some stage, we had a number of fairly good athletes who were rugby players like Kevin Schlachter and a few others like that there. And every time there was a game on or something like that, 147 guys would come in and sort of take over, basically. And when they arrived, Intake 146 Ospreys was still in the barrack room next to us. Their course instructor kept on giving WO2 McKinley and Sergeant Phelps grief about us being a bunch of wankers. So it became a rivalry thing. And of course, you know what rivalry is like. And it really pissed them off. And Captain Ron Marilliaroff, now, he says, once we were well into our training, 147 began to infiltrate everything. Roger Carloni, Mike Stobart Valaro, Fudd Harrison, and a couple of others made the School of Infantry first 15 rugby team, basically. And Wolf Fabiani and I ran this, Dave Steadman, ran the cross country for the Army and for some other guys to play squash. Whenever we turned up, we seemed to squeeze the 146 guys out. So they got a little bit upset about that. And they started to niggle at the 146 guys. But he said, whenever we arrived somewhere, Colour Sergeant Phillips, who was the first 15 fly half and captain, he would call out, "Never fear, 147 is here." So it started out as like a catch cry, just to sort of niggle the others on. I guess it was a thing to spur them on, get their spirits up and to make them work harder and whatever. But it became an issue because right at the end, when 147 finished the officers training course and they broke the battle records and everything like that, and a big cry came out from the crowd there, you know, never fear, 147 is here. And of course, from there, it carried on through Idep, and it was our OC, Major Fani Kutsia, who was RLI actually, and hell of a nice bloke. He was tough, but very, very good. And he sort of encouraged us to use that as our catch cry. And he actually wanted us to turn it into a song, but it never actually happened because things happened later on. But it sort of stuck with us, and it gave us a bit of encouragement, I guess, in times when things were bad. So when it's saying never fear, 147 is, yeah, it's not about us being better than anybody else. It's just something that came about. And it sort of gives you an idea of the sort of camaraderie we had with each other. And we really had to fight, because out there at Inyanga, it was one of the hardest places to actually be in, because you were isolated, really isolated. And right outside the camp, there was this huge mountain, which we used to call Black Bitch. Now, it was a bitch, because the color, most of the time there, the clouds would come in and it would make it all very dark and black and gloomy, and a huge granite outcrop on the top. But because it overlooked the camp, I believe anyway, that the regulars would make us run up this bloody hill as often as possible. To me, I think what they wanted us to do was to clear the top and make sure that there was nothing there, but not to let us know that they worried about it. So we used to often have to run up this bloody hill and stand at the top and be counted off. And some of the guys started to get a bit cheeky with it, and sort of, I think a lot of people would remember Sergeant Major Jimmy Jamison, RLI. Now, he gets a fair good mention in that book, They Call Me Croaks, and he's just recently passed away. And I think when I first brought my first book out, I actually met up with him in Cape Town, and we swapped books and signed each other's book, and that, which was great, you know, because you know, he was a hell of a character. He was. And
Dennis Crocamp.
Yes, Dennis Crocamp. He was a hell of a bloke, because when I met him there, he was busy chopping wood and all sorts, and you know, he was full beard, and he was, you know, still a bear, you know. And he sadly passed away just recently too. But honestly, we had a hard time out there, and we couldn't get Fire Force in, because one, it was pretty dangerous for them to come out there, because they couldn't keep them there. We had a heavy pad, yes. And towards the end, every time you heard that bloody siren go off, you just automatically grab your gear and head off to the helipad, waiting to be picked up and taken in. Sometimes it was 1 or 2 times a day, you know. We did a lot of work on the ground. Those mountains were huge. What would happen was the sirens would go off, and you'd have to automatically, you'd feel that you knew something was happening, and automatically the response was to grab your gear and head off to the helipad. And it was a frequent occurrence out there, but that was always for the platoon that was in R&R, basically, because you'd go out, and for 1 week out of every so many, you'd remain in camp, but your duties there were to be on standby. So it wasn't really a relaxing, and you never really had anywhere to go to except for Troutbeck, which was the Troutbeck Inn, you know. And getting up there, you know, as a driver, we used to really give the guys a lot of hell. We'd be flying around these damn corners and sliding. I remember taking some party guys up there. They were pretty old, and us little young fellas in the back, and we was Alistair Bush and myself, because we were the 2 platoon drivers, you know, and we were going down there. When we got to the end there, he got off the truck. He says, "I'm not going back with you bastards. Who the hell do you think you are?" You know, he gave us a reference to some, I forget the driver's name, but the Formula One driver, basically. And we sort of giggled, but he refused to come back with us. But we had a number of incidents out there. There are a lot of funny ones, but there are a lot of sad ones too. The amount of incidents that were very important when it comes to politically, and that is Nafaru Farm was was where Mugabe actually escaped through to Mozambique from, and it was they were Canadians, Canadian missionaries, and what had happened there before was Major Kutse said that he and a few of his officers and NCOs, the regulars, were ordered to go and lay an ambush. And he said they actually had Mugabe in his sights when the call came through and from very high up and said, leave it alone, don't touch, which was very, very strange. But shortly after that, they kept it very secret. And we had a call come in from the bailiff came in because they were just down the road from where we are there. And they informed us that there was a large group coming across the border along the Rhodesia River. And we were to go down and set up ambush. Now, to get there, you had to go all the way past Traffic in and through the bloody hills and the mountains and then down. And you had to do like a 3-point turn to get around some of these corners. It was very, very difficult to negotiate because these trucks, we didn't have power steering or anything like that. Your arms would get really built up trying to pull around in 3-point circles, your turns. And it wasn't just one or two, it was just about coming down the hill like a zigzag all the way down to the river. There were 3 trucks. And basically what happened was nothing had really happened. We were just doing basically border patrol at that time. And we dropped the guys off and we headed back again. And it was starting to rain like hell. It was getting dark and getting late. But guess what? We had 2 escorts per truck. No radios. Not a radio between us. And we had to head our way back. And it's starting to get dark and the rain is coming down. And Alistair Bushney was at the back. He was the last vehicle there. And he had 2 Portuguese guys who didn't speak a lot of English. They were very broken English. And the one guy's name was Pacheco. It turned out later he could speak English better than anybody else, but he was actually SB. And he had been planted in with us. He was quite old. He was quite in his 30s. Big, strong boy, but he used to pretend that he couldn't speak English. It turned out he was actually SB. He admitted it later. But this was well after the war. But I think at that time, what they were trying to do was monitor us to make sure that none of us were going to split. So when you look at it from that perspective, you're only 18 and 19. You don't understand the politics that go on. It's only later on that you actually realize what was actually happening. And it's quite frightening to see just how regulated you were. Although anyway, what happened was, as we were coming back into the 3-point turn, and I couldn't see through to the back, and I'd bang on the cab, and the Corporal Alan at the back, he would, Alan Bell. He was quite a large fellow, and we had this brand new 4.5s, but it was the old style. It's one that didn't have the porthole in the top, the hatch. It just had that tiny little vent. And they weren't very big. But anyway, I banged on the cab and I said, as the last guy made the turn, because you see, you could only travel at 30 k's an hour, but the time it took you to do your 3-point turn to get around, you had to wait. But because I couldn't see, I banged on it and I said, "Are they around yet?" And he said, "Yes, they are," but they weren't, because he just, I don't know why he said that, but Alistair Bushney suddenly realized that we were about 700 meters away, too far away from him. So he put his foot down, and as he did that, he hit a huge ditch. And his front wheels, he just split the wishbones apart. And both wheels sort of went in opposite directions, and off he went into the road and bang, straight into the tree. And he couldn't radio us or anything like that. So he told Pacheco, he said, fire a couple of rounds overhead and call them back. So Pacheco, don't know why he did it, but he did. He aimed straight at us. And all I heard was coming past me, right past my window. Alan Bell on the top says, we've been ambushed, we've been ambushed. And he banged on the roof and he said, go like hell. He jumped. I swear to God, I don't know how he did it. He was a big boy, but he came straight through my cab, through the top. And this little vent's only about 12 inches. It's small, but he came through that damn air vent, poof, and he landed on my front seat next to me. And he just said, go. And the farm was just, the Faru farm was only just a few hundred meters up the road. And he said, we've got to get there, and we're going to, so basically we pulled into the two trucks pulled in there, and he raced to and this Canadian, you should have seen his face. It was like shock and horror. Uh-oh, what's happening? We need to use the phone. Suddenly they started covering everything and getting it. We were watching. We didn't really understand what was going on at the time, but you could see the fear in their face. All these nuns and everything, they were all really, whoops, what's happening? So Alan got on the phone and he phoned up Inyanga and said, there's been a contact, we've just been ambushed. One of the trucks hasn't returned, blah, blah, blah. And then once we hung up, then they said, well, it's too dark for us to get in there. He said, first light, we'll bring the choppers in and what have you. So we had to wait there that night. And as we were sort of waiting, within about 15 minutes after we'd done the phone call, Alistair Bush and his crew come walking up the road. And he says, why the hell did you leave us? He said, couldn't you see I'd gone off the road? He said, but we were ambushed. No, he says. He said, Pacheco just fired at you to try and get your attention. But he said, oh, shit. He said, but we've already called it in as an ambush. And he goes, oh, my God. He says, I'm in trouble now. He said, because we were put one scratch on those trucks since 56 days DB. And he had gone to put his into the ditch. And he says, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? And he said, well, tell them we were ambushed then. He says, this is the only way we can cover our arse. Next day, not RLI, it's not anybody else, but it's 4 bloody helicopters full of SB. Yeah. And we had to go and do a cordon search. We had to do a sweep. We couldn't find a single bloody AK round, nothing like that, just a few of these other rounds. And you see this glance between Pacheco and the leading SB officer. They looked at each other and it was like, don't you say a word. Weren't allowed to recognize each other. They recognized each other, but you could see it. But they wouldn't acknowledge the fact that they knew each other. So they kept on saying, oh, this is a lemon, you're bullshitting, you're doing this, there's no holes in the trucks, there's nothing. And we stuck to our story. Even Pacheco did. We got back to camp and Captain Dark interrogated us, each and every one of us. And we stuck to the story. And he said, you're bullshitting. No, it's true. They knew all along because Major Coetzee had already been and done an ambush there before. But it was told, they were told it's a no-go area. Don't touch it. We're watching. So they put in a Civil Scouts call sign to observe what was going on. Next minute, we get a call. Night coordinate search. Holy shit. We went in at, must have been, it was really dark at the time, about 10 o'clock. But it would have been about 10, 11 o'clock when we dropped the guys off. We had to drop them quite far away. And it was raining. And when I say raining, there was a huge cyclone off Mozambique at that time. It was consistent. You just couldn't see for the water. We dropped the guys off and we were coming back. And all I could see was the truck in front of me just suddenly start sliding off, and he started sliding back. There was no traction. He was just going uphill. There was no traction. I could just see him sliding off and then come towards me. All I could do was jam on brakes because there's a huge drop down this side and a cliff this side. There's nowhere to move. So as I jam on brakes, my truck just decides, hello, and slides straight off, and I just start going down this damn embankment, and it's just there's pine trees and granite rock crops and all sorts, and I'm just going down, stop, you bastard, stop. Eventually it stops. We were stuck there for the night. It was that cold and wet. The only thing I could find, so I was only in a damn t-shirt at the time, because when we went it was pretty warm. The weather changed so rapidly. And all I could find was a damn mosquito net to wrap around me for the whole night there waiting for it. The next morning, when these guys went in, they were actually instructed. No live ammo, bayonets. They surrounded it and they walked in at first light, and it was misty and it was cold and wet. And this damn Canadian comes walking out, and there's a leak. And he's sitting there having a fondle of one of the nannies there. And as they do that, all you heard from the whole was the company will advance 10 paces. It turns around, and there's the guys, the whole bloody company of men, marked 10 paces with the bayonets. Reason being, no international incident. These are Canadian citizens. No, you weren't allowed to shoot. But the fact that they were using a bayonet, people don't really like that. It was really weird, because, and as they caught them like that, there's a whole group. We found a whole group of gooks living there. They'd been hiding them, and they were storing. And what we uncovered there was all of Mugabe's law books. He'd only just been there. So he just escaped. And one of the aftermaths of that was we had to do it because the rivers were swollen and just pouring over the bridge there. He couldn't get trucks through. And Dave Stedman was actually standing there. He stopped this bloody white ute, his truck. And in the back, he looked in the back. And he saw black fella, really black. Didn't recognize him, but he told this guy, okay, that's it. You got to turn around and go back. When he got back to camp, as he got back to camp, they had all the photos of Mugabe. They were supposed to have been issued to us beforehand, but they weren't. So who was holding them back? Who knows? Dave Stedman takes one look at this and says, I've just let this bugger go. I've just seen him. And he got away. Yeah, well, basically what happened was after that, this was like at the tail end of it now, because we'd already gathered all his law books and everything, which all ended up in the Officer Special 3 Idep, which was quite an amazing thing there, because all these law books that he was, I guess he would have been pretty annoyed the fact that we pitched all his gear, but the fact that he had slipped through our hands a second time was pretty annoying. But like with 5 Idep, the contacts that were happening, we did a number of engagements with them. Now, I think a lot of people may recognize the name of Lieutenant Neil Jackson. He was 147 national serviceman. He was one of our officers, and they may also recognize Roger Carloni. Later became RLI. He was also an officer, but he was 1 platoon officer, and 3 platoons officer was Mike Stobart Valero. Also went regular. And he got a Silver Cross. I think 147 had 3 Bronze Crosses, 1 Silver Cross, and a number of other citations as well. We were actually going to be put in twice for a unit citation. It was rejected because of a conflict, and I think it explains it in the book. I think the best way to sort of describe that was with Major Katsu. What he said in regards to that was, it was 1 platoon officer, 1 platoon officer, and a number of other citations as well. We were actually going to be put in twice for a unit citation. It was rejected because of a conflict, and I think it explains it in the book. I think the best way to sort of describe that was with Major Katsu. What he said in regards to that was he was pretty impressed with us, because basically he was actually put at 3 Idep to straighten it out, because he said it wasn't functioning as it should. General John Shaw was tasked him with the fact to go and sort 3 Idep out. And Major Coetzee said, I'll do it on one condition. And he said, I'll choose my own men. And he chose Jimmy Jamison as his Sergeant Major, Errol Mann from RAR, one of the most brilliant battle captains you can possibly imagine. I mean, this guy, you know, you would have followed him through hell and back. He was used to call him Madman, but I think you've seen, if you've got that little cartoon that was made up from the Battle of Inyanga, where he went hurtling through the hen house there. Basically, that was just classic of him, because he actually charged across the mealie field with all the cooks and bottle washers across towards the river line, where the Terps were all hiding in. And it is kind of a scene out of F Troops, watching the bloody bugle, these guys sort of hanging out the trucks, waiting and charging across this bloody mealie field. But just as that was happening, the choppers were landing, and he had to pull back from that and divide the guys up and put them in the choppers for stop groups and what have you. And from there on, that battle was on. And Sergeant Otto Crick played a huge part in actually finding them. His stick, along with 4 police trackers, walked all the way through. And Otto was a big fellow, and he could walk. It was pretty hard to catch up to him. And but he said every time he moved forward, he said the 4 black cops would sort of hang back. And he said he didn't like this idea, because it's almost as if they were dragging him, holding him back. And he went to this one village there where he interrogated one of the locals there, the headman, which he knew. And sometimes he'd give information to the terrorists, and sometimes he'd give it to us as well. And so Otto sort of knew him from previous experiences there. And he said to him, listen, I've just lost one of my best friends here. He said, you better tell me the truth, where they've been fed, or there's going to be trouble. And he said, no, he says, they're over there. He said, the whole village has gone out, including his wife, to feed them. And they took off. And he went up this hill and he spotted them. As he's going on as he's looking looking down, he spotted this huge V formation coming out of the bush. And he says, got him. And he came hurtling down to engage them. But the 4 cops behind him just didn't want to join in. But it turned out to be all the woman there with all the food that they'd just been feeding the terrorists there with. And he called it in, and he took one of the woman and one of the policemen as an interpreter. And they went up in the helicopter twice. And just as I think she must have got a bit disorientated, because never been up in a helicopter or anything like that. So he asked the pilot to come back down lower and to go back to where they were, so they can find their bearings again. And then as they were sort of lifting around and moving about, flying in circles around, the pilot just sort of said, look, it looks like it's 11, and we can't find anything. And just as that happened, he said, Otto just said it was like a seething mass underneath. They said the whole ground underneath just seemed to roil with bodies as they started moving and breaking cover. And they just opened up on them. And he said, while they were shooting like that, he said, you could actually hear the rotor blades suddenly change pitch. A couple of bullets straight through the rotor. But the amazing thing was, the conflict was now on. They found them, and everything came together from there on. And it was an amazing battle, which was really kept low key in all the newspapers and everything. Because as you can imagine, Geneva Convention was on. There was the political. They did not want us the general public to panic, because this was a huge punch up, to be honest. I mean, to have a full artillery company 65 of them. And these guys are carrying huge equipment, and they had God knows how many bearers carrying the stuff as well. So the amount of men and equipment, they knew what they were doing. They were trained well. We weren't up against the second-rate troops. These were first-rate. These guys have been trained really well, and they knew what they were up to, and they had a mission, and they very nearly succeeded. If it hadn't have been for a few little, like I say, sometimes in life, situations, they change, and we take it as it is, because a lot of it depended on luck. Our situation there was perilous, really, because we're really at the back end of the world, very little in support. We had to change our tactics. And a lot of those changes came about and were taken by Major Kutsi into the training school. And a lot of those tactics were actually taught to the new recruits, which is quite amazing. But all in all, I think the stories within here, and there's a lot of them, and with some of the 5 Idep stories, again, are huge. Neil Jackson, and 147 5 Idep operated for a whole year out of Grand Reef as Fire Force, which quite unheard of, really, national servicemen. And the KCAL commander was actually Neil Jackson, the second lieutenant national serviceman. And the opening of Operation Thrasher was opened with a cross-border raid into Mozambique with Salute Scouts and 5 Idep in support. We were busy. We really were busy, and we took a lot of casualties. For the amount of work that we actually did out there, and for the amount of casualties we actually had, we were very lucky. But a lot of wounded, especially 5 Idep. Steve Japp was one of the first spinal injuries. When Mark Torrington and then 3 of our guys were actually killed and a number wounded, just because of a lone gook in a mango tree. We'd hidden. They got all the other gooks, but one of them escaped and hid it in a bloody mango tree. Steve Japp, I think, is a really storyline in that he was an enormous athlete. Tennis, squash, you name it. He was good at it, at anything he put his hand to. But to be paralyzed like that, it was actually our first contact from 147. It was the first kill, first casualty for 147, but it had an impact because realizing that he'd been wounded that badly and straight through the spine like that, he had a huge spinal injury, but he's made a huge success. Lives in Cape Town then, got his PhDs, and he's done he's had a wonderful life. Yeah, well, he's managed to make something for himself as a agricultural expert, a winery. He's done. It's hard to think that somebody who's so athletic and to be made a paraplegic like that in that way. But his spirit is high. Anything he puts his hand to, he'll achieve. And he's one of the nicest guys you can talk to, honestly. He's so down to earth. That's a lot of those stories. There's some quite tragic stories in there.
Mm. Some of them, I seem to recall that you were involved. Was it Kuhn? Or you don't want to talk about that? Kuhn.
Which one?
The one where, yeah. You want to not talk about that because of his family and stuff?
I think I'd like to really, because on R&R at the time, just before he died, and I'd actually taken his LMG out on patrol, and when we got called back, because the day before the battle, there was a huge engagement of 80 terrorists. RLI were engaged in, and one platoon was called in as reinforcements, and actually one platoon killed 8 of the 10 in a full-on frontal basically a classic assault on their position, which was quite incredible. And some of the RLI guys that were sitting there watching going on, when they returned, we had this one platoon sergeant, his name was John Costello, big, tall, red-headed, lanky thing, you know, and the rumours were that he was ex-IRA, and he worked in Wanky as a powder monkey, basically. So you can imagine, I don't know what the truth is, to be honest, but was he IRA? I don't know. Was he Irish? Bloody hell, he is. He could drink whiskey like you never knew. He was a hell of a character. But anyway, as they were coming back, this RLI trooper came up to him and said to him, "Jesus, who are you guys?" He said, "The USAS." And he said in his broad Irish accent, he says, "Never you fucking mind." It was so strange. It did say, you know, doesn't really matter. But I think it kind of impressed them, because at that stage we'd been really quite battle hardened, but that assault, I think, must have impressed anybody to see. But it was, and then there was the one captured group, that the terrorist, that they got that information as to where, and from there on, that was when they made and basically Fred Kunna just come in on a resupply, and he wasn't feeling the best. He'd actually come back, and he'd been in Salisbury, and he'd gone through a red light, traffic light, and got cameraed on it, and got upset with this, went back and then smashed the camera. So he was not happy. But when he came back, and suddenly he was very, almost depressed, or what, I don't know how to say it, but it was changed. It was a change man. Because Fred used to love to drink. And they offered him, everybody a beer there, basically, you know, before getting settled up in there, and he turned it down, first time in history. And I thought, what's going on, you know? But Major could see had to go back to camp, and I was the only driver left to take him back. So I took the resupply back with me, with Major Kutsi, and so therefore I swapped places with Fred. And for me, that was pretty harsh, because I mean, it could have been me when I look at it from that perspective. And it's very hard, because, you know, he was such a likable guy, and to see that what had happened, you know, it was almost as if he knew. But it's very sad, because he was a very likable guy. Everybody liked him. Very tall, lanky thing, and some of the things that he'd went through, you know, very funny bloke. He always had a smile, always had a joke. He was very easygoing, and like I say, it's hard. It's a hard thing to see somebody like that, sort of be to pass on like that. I think it really broke his family's heart as well. And the same sort of incident was with Tony Brackus when he was killed with the RPG rocket. I mean, he came out basically, and to replace, he didn't want to go back to camp, and made up some excuse and said, "You have to take your truck back to 3NF and get it serviced." And I said, "No, you can't. You know, this isn't on. I want to stay out." And he said, "No." But such as it was, I had to go back, and then bang, several days later, he's dead. You know, he was killed with that RPG rocket, and that was a horrendous story, that one there. That's all in the book. And
Tell us the story about the RPG rocket, because a lot of people haven't had the opportunity to read the book.
Oh, okay. Well, basically what happened
I know it's not a pretty story.
No, I have to be really sensitive about it as well, because the families, both families, they were the first two Greeks to be killed in the war too. Tony Vrakis and Steph Gerokelis. And what happened was there'd been an incident, and there had been a couple of contacts which Mike Sobert Bolaro had been involved in, and there were only the two trucks out there, but two platoons, and there weren't sufficient drivers out there, and they had to go out and drop them off. I had to go back to 3N, but there was the only two drivers. There was only one 3-platoon driver and one 2-platoon driver, the two vehicles, and basically they were worn out. They were tired because they had to do a lot of drop-offs and taking guys backwards and forwards. And basically, this particular day was the fact that they couldn't find a second driver to drive the second vehicle, so only one vehicle went out to drop these guys off. And the terrorists set an ambush. And basically what had happened was they watched the truck come through, and instead of hitting it, they wanted to count how many trucks there were. You saw one truck laden down with guys. And then you looked at that and said, oh, we'll hit this one on the back. It's only one vehicle. So on the return, as they're coming down it's like a hill down the road, down to Ella Mission there. And they opened up with an RPG rocket, and it hit the cab square right in where the driver was. Now, Steph Gerokelis should not have been in the front seat because it shouldn't have been there, but it was at that time when things weren't that hot at the time, and being a bit sloppy with it. Steph was blown out the side of the truck, very badly burnt. But poor old Tony was hit square and burnt alive. Or whether he was alive, I'd say he was dead. But the aftermath was horrific to see, because when you had to go and do the recovery on it, and Brian Gombard, who was on the back, he said the force of the explosion threw him to the back of the truck, and he actually had a lot of injuries to his hand, and then they had to sew fingers back, and all sorts of things like that. So he had a horrific time there. And then, of course, Steph Gerokelis had been blown out the truck further because it continued to roll down until it stopped in front. And the only two that were actually left there was only two left on the back of the truck, and that was Brian Gombard and Franzi Manning, which I remember from Plumtree. And they sort of folded out. Malcolm Richardson had obviously been blown off the back of the truck as well, somewhere down the road. But the shock for that was when they found him, he was actually coming down the road, virtually naked. And he climbed under the truck and under the same sandbags. The shock was horrendous for him. So you can imagine how much you got to feel sorry for the poor guy. But Brian and Franzi were the only two firing back until they got relieved there. But it was a huge mess, and trying to get the choppers in at the time because it was getting dark and far away. Eventually getting the Kazakhing these guys off, and Steph died several days. I think it was about 10 days later from complications from the burn, the pneumonia, and it really put a damper on us because those were our first two deaths at 3N, and shortly after that, Cole Weenan got blown up by a hand grenade, an accidental hand grenade explosion, and he was killed there. And Chris Cousin was wounded. We had to go in at night again driving through it's not a pleasant job to drive a truck at night, knowing full well that there's terrorists out there. You got your damn headlights on as you're driving through. You're just a huge target. But we're out there all night, eventually finding them and shooting up Icarus flares to light up the area and we had one guy climb up a tree, trying to find these guys in the dark because there was no moon, nothing. And like I say, there was a lot of these incidents. 5 Idep was full of them as well. There's some pretty horrendous ones there. By all means, read the book, because I can sit and talk and not get down to the detail that's been put into it. Take my hat off to Paul Allen for putting it together as well. These maps.
How do our viewers get hold of the book? And I know. Am I correct that the proceeds of the book are going to some sort of charity?
Well, basically, what we did was we formed a not-for-profit company, which enables us not to, it's sort of like a tax benefit thing, but all the profits from the book are going towards Rhodesian veterans to help them. So
great.
This is an effort here to try and help some of our less fortunate who have fallen on hard times. It's kind of our way of saying thanks to them as well.
For sure.
And, by all means, this isn't just about 147. I've got to give credit to Intake 151 who joined us for 6 months, and I think we were the only independent company that actually were able to train our relief and get them blooded into and to help them, and that tradition sort of continued on with every subsequent. In that, basically what had happened was, like, when 151 first arrived, they were, according to Fonny he said they weren't up to scratch. Because at that time, I think they were just young kids at the time. They weren't very old. And I guess the stock was thinning. And he said, no, we've got to do 10 days retraining first before we deploy back into the Hondi Valley. And so what happened was he got us as the senior intake to help them by, we did a battle camp out there. So we did a lot of training with them and got them sort of up to speed with it and trying to polish them up a bit on procedures and everything. And then we were deployed straight out after 10 days back into the Hondi. And our very first day arriving at Rhodesia BC camp there, a huge contact had started, and Intake 151 lost their first guy then. But from there on, the training was sort of stepped up with it, and eventually what would happen was they would put at least 1 to 2 of the 151 guys and integrate them into the 147 platoons. So, and then train them. They would go out with an experienced group. Once they'd been done, swap them back out. And so they were given, and this tradition continued along with 157 when they came in. 151 did the same thing for them, and so on as it went, which was, I think we were the only ones that actually, because we had a double company and staggered it 6 months apart, it was a good opportunity because it gave, and I think where we were was probably one of the hardest places to actually get blooded, because you're right on the border there. Same with 5 Idep and 6 Idep. They also had a hell of a hard time up there too, because you're sitting there right on the border basically, and it did get hot. It got very. It was right at towards the end of the war, and towards the end of the war, there were no-go areas where, and it became almost impossible. So it was a hard place. With this book, this isn't just about 147. I think anybody who was ever a national serviceman or anything like that, the experiences of going through training and the experiences you can relate to, and that's what we wanted people to understand is, don't think of it just as that. This is about, for every national serviceman that there ever was, here you are, here's a story. You can relate to it.
Mm. I must say, I can understand what you're saying. I did my SAS selection course in Inyanga, and our first RV point on day one, which was we had to carry these logs over through the Gomos, and our RV was Inyanga Falls, which you know quite well. Our second RV was World's View, and our third RV was the base of Mount Inyanga, and then we had to go up to the top of Mount Inyanga and down and along the Pungwi Gorge all the way to Causeway Cottages, and we had to do that in 6 hours. So we had from 6 a.m. to 12 in 6 hours to get to the top of Mount Inyanga, along the Pungwi Gorge all the way to Causeway Cottages. And then the poor officers who were going on selection for SAS, they had to carry on further up into Inyanga Gardens, you know, and because they always had to do a little bit more than the troopies, you know. And then I think then we were getting towards the end. We had to go through Inyanga Gardens, but you know, you had like in Inyanga Gardens, you had like jungle, you know, and then yeah, and then you had like this bracken, this, you know, because we weren't allowed to walk on the roads, and I mean, walking through that thick bracken, okay, it's only maybe knee height, but it scratches you, and it's almost impenetrable, you know, that thick bracken. And then, you know, it's so mountainous, and the Gomos, you know, and trying to read a map in those Gomos, magnetic north is all over the place, you know. There's powerful magnetic, eh? Yeah, so I found it very difficult to accurately map read. You had to basically follow the features because your compass bearing was always out, you know, from magnetic north. So, yeah, no, I have big respect for guys who were in that area, because that area was tough. And then, strangely enough, when I got married at the tender age of 19, both my ex-wife and I were both 19. We went on honeymoon to Trout Beck, and one of the things I did was take her to Umtali Falls to have a look at those beautiful falls. And the day after we were there, I believe some tourists were, or a tourist, or people were killed there. They were the terrorists killed some Europeans there. Is that right? Yep. Do you remember that incident?
Correct.
Yeah.
I think it's a story in the book about that Paul Allen talks about, because he was actually a signaller, and we actually had a relay station right there by Umtali Falls.
Mm.
And you actually look out over walls, and you look straight into the Hondi Valley there. And, you know, if you woke up with mist, you'd be very careful, because you just got one wrong step and you're down.
Yeah.
And I think Alistair Bushney and I were the only two to take a 2.5 up to the top of World's View, where 3.8, where we had a relay station on 3.8 up top there when we did a resupply there. Took us all day to drive this damn guinea mug up there over those huge granite boulders and what have you.
I just wanted to ask you, is Alistair Bushney related to George Bushney, the chopper tech?
That's his brother.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yep. Alistair's twin brother Leslie was in intake 139 at Inyanga, and Alistair's brother George was a chopper tech.
That's
right.
I think
he did an interview with him. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
They both live out here in Perth.
Dave, thanks so much for the time that you've spent sharing about Intake 147. I know you have lots of other stories which you haven't covered about Neil Jackson and people like that. So let's do that in another episode. But thank you so much. I'm going to stop recording now.
Okay, no worries. Be great.